One essay, one underestimated student, one mistake the teacher will never forget. What started as a harmless grade turned into a public reckoning on national TV. The sun hung low over the modest rooftops of Clearwood, casting amber streaks across the linoleum floors at Jefferson High School. The classroom clock ticked with the slow patience of the sleepy afternoon. Its soft clicks drowned under the murmur of restless teenagers waiting for the final bell. Dust motes floated in shafts of golden light slicing through the aged blinds, making the whole room feel like it existed between time half asleep, half waiting to be remembered. Room 3B smelled faintly of dry markers, old books, and overworked. Heaters. The walls were lined with faded posters quoting dead poets in fonts too small to inspire. And on the far side, a row of fluorescent lights flickered above like broken thoughts trying to stay alive. Desks were arranged in sterile rows, every surface etched with years of carved initials and ink-stained silent protests from students who never quite fit the mold. At the very back, in the far left corner beneath a cracked whiteboard, sat Amara. James. 16 years old, skin the color of deep brown earth, eyes soft but watchful. Her hair-tight coils falling just past her shoulders framed her face like a quiet halo. She wore a faded hoodie 2 sizes too big, sleeves stretched from nervous fingers pulling at the cuffs. Around her wrist hung a woven bracelet, red, green, and black worn, and nearly unraveling. No one ever called on Amara unless they had to. She was the kind of student teachers didn't remember until roll call reminded them. The kind who handed in assignments on time but without flourish. Who never raised her hand unless she was sure the answer was perfect. The kind who, through no fault of her own, had learned to disappear in plain sight. Mr. Lowell, on the other hand, made his presence known before he even entered a room. His shoes clicked like punctuation marks down the hallway, and students instinctively straightened in their seats as he passed. A man of rules and rubrics, he believed structure was salvation, and anything too abstract, too emotional, too different was distraction. Aged, clean-shaven with graying temples and a pressed shirt that always smelled faintly of aftershave. Mr. Lowell had taught English for nearly 2 decades, but time had not softened him. If anything, it had calcified his beliefs, that brilliance followed form, that talent could be measured by tone, and that certain students, the ones who spoke well, the ones whose parents came to parent-teacher night, were simply more promising than others. He didn't dislike Amara. In fact, it would have been hard to say he thought of her at all. She was ... quiet, unremarkable, a shadow among brighter, louder shapes. A C+ student in his mental ledger, someone who'd maybe pass, maybe not, but likely wouldn't write anything worth remembering. As the last few minutes of class ticked by, Mr. Lowell stood at the front, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like a drill sergeant performing a final inspection. "All right," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the haze of boredom. "Before you go, I want you all to write this down." Pens lifted, phones lowered. Even the back row straightened slightly. "Next week's assignment," he continued, enunciating each syllable as if it might be forgotten otherwise, "is an essay titled, 'What Freedom Means to Me,' 1,000 words minimum. Due next Friday. No exceptions. I want thoughtfulness, structure, and above all realism. No fantasy, no poetry. Keep your feet on the ground." A few students groaned. Someone muttered a joke. A boy in the front raised his hand to ask a question. He hadn't even thought of yet Mr. Lowell's favorite kind. From the back corner, Amara scribbled the assignment in her planner. She hesitated as her pen hovered over the word freedom. Her lips tightened. For a moment, she looked out the window. Beyond the glass, the sky was painted in soft oranges and purples, like a world too beautiful to belong to her. Mr. Lowell's eyes swept the room again. He paused just for a second on Amara, Then he spoke, not directly to her, but just loud enough. "And remember," he said with a tight, dismissive smile, "don't try to be philosophers or poets. Just answer the question." A few kids chuckled. Amara didn't laugh. She didn't speak. She simply looked down at her notebook, then closed it with quiet resolve. Her heart thudded once hard, but she showed nothing on her face. Outside, the bell finally rang. Backpacks zipped, chairs scraped. Mr. Lowell was already erasing the board when the students filed out. Amara was the last to leave, walking past him in silence, her hands curled into fists inside her sleeves. He didn't look up. She didn't look back. And just like that, the first thread of a revolution was written into the air quiet as dust, floating in sunlight no one thought to see. The hallways of Jefferson High were already thinning when Amara made her way to the bus stop. The low sun cast long shadows that stretched like tired limbs across the cracked pavement. In her backpack, the assignment page felt heavier than its weight deserved, like a dare sealed in paper. "What freedom means to me." The title buzzed in her head like a question with no right answer. She didn't speak much on the ride home. The yellow school bus bounced through uneven roads as students laughed, cursed, and scrolled through their phones. Amara sat by the window, her knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the blurred world passing outside. No one sat next to her. No one usually did at home. Her little brother Malik greeted her with a loud Mara as soon as she stepped through the door. He was 7, bright-eyed, and boundlessly energetic. Their mother, still in her nursing scrubs, offered Amara a tired smile from the kitchen as she stirred a pot of something warm and familiar. "Homework?" her mother asked, her voice soft but lined with fatigue. Amara nodded and held up the assignment sheet. Her mom glanced at it briefly and smiled faintly. "You'll do great, baby. You always write from the heart." That night, Amara lay on her bed with her journal resting on her lap. The ceiling fan hummed above her, and the dim light from her desk lamp made the pages glow like old parchment. She opened her notebook, its pages crowded with poems, fragments, and memories she never showed anyone. She flipped to a blank page and wrote the title, slowly. "What freedom means to me." Her hand froze. How could she even begin? Freedom. It wasn't just an idea in a textbook or a statue on a harbor. For her, it was the aching silence when her mother came home crying because another patient had spat at her. It was the night they were pulled over for driving too slow and forced to stand on the side of the road with their hands up while Malik cried. It was her grandmother's stories of being called names while fighting to integrate a school that didn't want her. She closed the journal and stared at the ceiling. The next day, the mood in Mr. Lowell's classroom was oddly buoyant. Students were cracking jokes, throwing paper balls when the teacher wasn't looking. It was as if no one remembered what had been assigned, or they simply didn't care. Amara, however, couldn't forget it if she tried. As she quietly gathered her books, she noticed Mr. Lowell lingering near his desk, flipping through a folder. Then he looked up. His eyes swept the room until they landed on her. Briefly, it wasn't a glare, exactly. Not anger. Just the kind of glance you give a vending machine you know is out of order. A quick, dismissive flick. Then came the words. Quiet enough to pretend they weren't meant for her. Loud enough to land like a slap. "Let's keep it realistic, people. Don't try to be poets." A few kids snickered. One of them elbowed his friend and whispered something that made them both laugh under their breath. Amara felt her ears burn. The comment wasn't directed at her. Not officially. But it hung in the air like a rotten smell unmistakably aimed. Mr. Lowell didn't even need to point. His tone carried the message. You're not the kind of student who writes anything worth reading. Don't try too hard. It won't matter anyway. Amara stared down at her desk, her fingers curled tightly around her pen. She felt her throat tighten, her chest constricting as if the oxygen in the room had thinned. But she didn't cry. She didn't even blink. Instead, something in her shifted. A small fire deep in her gut ignited. Not the kind that exploded, but the kind that burned slowly and refused to die. She let the laughter wash over her like rain against stone. She didn't rise to it, didn't give Mr. Law the satisfaction of reaction. But in her head, a storm was brewing. That night, she returned to the blank page in her journal. Her hand hovered over the paper again, and then she began. Not with definitions or structured thesis paragraphs, but with the image of her grandmother marching in Birmingham, knuckles scraped from holding up a protest sign for hours. Then she wrote about Malik, hugging her so hard after they were released from that terrifying traffic stop. She wrote about her mother's silence when she came home from work and sat alone on the porch, staring at nothing. She wrote it all. Came in bursts, sometimes like fire, sometimes like floodwater. She didn't stop to edit, didn't pause to second guess. Her voice, long ignored, filled every line like thunder in a canyon. By the end of the week, the essay had grown into something larger than she had planned. It wasn't an assignment anymore. It was a story, a witness, a confession, a rebellion on paper. When she printed it out and slid it into the folder from Mr. Lowell, she did it without ceremony. No dramatic stares, no speech, just quiet resolve. Because she knew deep down that freedom, real freedom, wasn't just something you wrote about. It was something you claimed, even if no one believed you had the right to. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rattle of the neighborhood train passing through like a ghost. The smell of leftover spaghetti lingered in the air. Malik was already asleep, his soft snores drifting down. The hall and their mother had collapsed on the couch with her arm flung over her eyes, still in her scrubs. Amara sat at her desk, the glow from her small desk lamp washing her room in golden warmth. The outside world had dimmed into a blur of streetlight shadows, but inside her room, memories flickered like candle flames flickering, impossible to ignore. She reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out a leather-bound notebook, worn at the edges, the spine held together by old tape and years of trust. It was her hiding place, her sanctuary, her secret rebellion. Between its covers lived scraps of poetry, sketches of moments too painful to say aloud, letters she'd never send, and truths she had buried in ink. She ran her fingers over the cover slowly, almost reverently, then opened to a fresh page. A blank canvas stared back at her. She took a breath and reached for the keyboard. The hum of her old laptop filled the silence as it booted up, its fan already wheezing slightly. She opened a new document and placed the notebook beside her lifeline, her compass. The title blinked on the screen. What freedom means to me. She stared at it for a long while. Then her fingers began to move. At first, the words came slow, cautious, then faster, urgent, like a dam had broken. Her hands trembled on the keys, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was releasing. This wasn't just an assignment. This was history demanding to be spoken. She wrote about her mother, the night they'd been at the grocery store, and a security guard accused her of stealing because she had forgotten to scan a bag of rice at the self-checkout. Amara remembered how her mother had calmly explained it was a mistake, how the guard had called the police anyway, how they had handcuffed her in front of Amara and Malik like she was a criminal. She had only just turned 12. They let her mother go. Let her mother go. Eventually. But Amara never forgot the look in her eyes as they drove home in silence, anger mixed with shame, all buried behind the wheel of that old Honda Freedom. Amara typed slowly, "Is the right to exist without fear?" She paused, pressing the heel of her hand against her eyes. Then continued. She wrote about her father, who had come to the U.S. from Senegal with a dream and a work visa, who married her mother and built a life until a paperwork error flagged him in a government system. He had been picked up on his way to work. She still remembered the last time she saw him through a glass wall, phone pressed to her ear, his hands shaking as he whispered, "I'll try to come back." That was 4 years ago. "Freedom is not a privilege to be granted," she typed. "It is a birthright too often denied." She stopped to breathe. Her hands hovered above the keys, stiff from emotion. Then her eyes wandered to her desk. There, nestled between a stack of textbooks and an empty cup of tea, sat a small, black and white photograph. The corners were bent. The surface creased. But the image was clear. It showed a young woman, her eyes defiant, being dragged by 2 white policemen through a sea of angry protesters. Her blouse was torn. Blood ran down her arm. But her mouth was open in a cry, mid-chant, mid-roar, mid-resistance. Her grandmother, Evelyn James. Amara picked up the photo and held it close. She had seen it hundreds of times, but tonight it pulsed with new meaning. This wasn't just history. It was legacy. It was blood memory. It was the fire she came from. She placed the photo gently beside her keyboard and whispered aloud, "I see you." Then she went back to typing faster now. Each paragraph peeled back another layer. Each sentence cut closer to bone. On the wall above her desk hung a yellowed newspaper clipping. Most people didn't notice it, mistaking it for just another article. But Amara knew every word by heart. It told the story of Mr. Leon Carter, a decorated Vietnam veteran who had been denied housing in a neighborhood less than a mile from her. Schooled because the HOA board claimed his presence might upset the balance. They meant he was black. He'd been forced to sleep in his car for weeks. No one had been held accountable. Freedom, Amara wrote, should not be erased by zip code or skin color. The essay was becoming something wild, something alive. It braided, past and present together. Her grandmother's courage, her mother's resilience, her father's vanishing, and her own quiet defiance. She wrote not just from her head, but from her marrow. And when she finally stopped, fingers sore, heart racing, the screen glowed with over 2,000 words. She read the last line aloud. "Freedom is when I no longer have to explain why I deserve it." The room fell silent again. But it wasn't empty. It was full of the voices that had carried her here. And though the world outside still spun in its quiet injustice, in that moment, in that room, a revolution had begun in the form of a teenage girl with a voice no one had expected. The morning of essay submission was unusually warm for early spring. Sunlight spilled through the school's windows like gold poured over stone, and the scent of fresh-cut grass drifted faintly through the cracked open hallway doors. But inside, room 3B, the air was thick with anticipation, and for Amara, a quiet kind of dread. She sat at her desk with the essay tucked neatly into a slim folder. The corners were carefully aligned, her name typed in bold just above the title. "What Freedom Means to Me." Amara's hands rested flat on the cover as if holding something sacred. Because to her, that's what it was. Across the room, Mr. Lowell stood behind his desk, rifling through a stack of submissions like he was flipping through junk mail. His expression was blank, his lips tight in that perpetual line that made students. Unsure whether he was ever truly satisfied with anything. Amara watched him as he picked up each essay, scribbled quick marks on the top page, and moved on without so much as a second glance. She noticed how his pen paused on a few essays written by his favorite students. One from Jacob, the class valedictorian. Another from Lindsay, who always quoted Shakespeare and called him Sir, like a soldier awaiting promotion. Then he reached Amara's. He didn't react at first, just stared at her name for a long, still second. Then he sighed. It wasn't loud, but it was pointed. Dismissive. Like the sound someone makes when they realize they've picked up the wrong item at the grocery store. He opened it slowly, flipped a few pages, his eyes skimming, not lingering. A few lines, a few seconds. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he scrawled something in red ink on the top right corner. C+, no hesitation, no commentary. Just a judgment sealed before the story had even been heard. Amara saw it all from her desk. The lazy way he turned her pages. The way his eyes glazed over, uninterested, unmoved. She knew he hadn't really read it. Not the way she had written it, not with his heart, or even with curiosity. Her stomach tightened. She looked down at her hands in her lap, trying to steady the quiet storm gathering in her chest. Mr. Lowell cleared his throat. "Well," he said, looking out at the class, "I read through most of your essays last night. Some interesting takes." He picked up a few folders and waved them in the air. "Jacob," he said, "well done, clear structure. Excellent reference to Jefferson's writings. Lindsay's strong voice, good citations. That's the kind of thing I'm looking for. Thoughtful, realistic." Then he reached for Amara's essay again, held it up between two fingers like it might crumble. "Now, on the other hand," he continued, "some of you turned in. Dramatic monologues masquerading as essays." There were a few nervous chuckles from the front row. He tapped Amara's folder against the desk without naming her. But everyone knew. Too emotional. Lacked structure. "More personal diary than academic response," he said, his voice sharp and clipped. "You're not being graded on how you feel. This is about analysis, clarity, grounded thought. Stay in reality next time." The words landed like tiny, precise knives. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't speak, but something inside her cracked, not broken, not defeated, but split open, like a shell giving way to something that needed air. She could feel her classmates' eyes on her, some sympathetic, some curious, a few just watching for the reaction. But she gave them none. Mr. Lowell continued talking, but his voice had faded into the background, drowned out by the rush of blood in her ears. She reached out calmly, picked up her essay from the corner of his desk where he had laid it, and walked back to her seat. She sat still for the remainder of the class, the folder resting in her lap like a wounded bird. When the bell rang, she didn't linger. She gathered her things quietly and made her way to the door. Mr. Lowell didn't look at her, didn't say anything. As she stepped out into the hallway, the noise of students shifting between classes buzzed around her like static. But in her chest, there was only silence. Not emptiness, just stillness. A moment of knowing. She had told her truth. It hadn't been heard. Not yet. But that didn't make it any less true. Closing image outside. The sun had risen higher, painting the sidewalk in gold. Amara walked into the light without looking back. Her essay held tight to her chest pages, filled with the kind of truth that may be ignored by some, but would not stay hidden forever. Because some stories, once written, carry their own wings. The hallway was nearly empty now. The muffled echo of footsteps had faded into the silence of transition time. Lockers stood like sentinels in rows, their chipped paint and dented surfaces witness to years of unnoticed moments. Somewhere, a bell rang distantly for another class to begin. Amara sat alone on the cold linoleum floor, tucked between two trophy cases, knees drawn to her chest. She wasn't crying, not loudly, but the tears slid silently down her cheeks, leaving dark trails. On her skin, she pressed the sleeve of her hoodie against her face, hoping no one would notice. But the hallway, much like the classroom, had a way of pretending she wasn't there. Except someone did see her. A slow shuffle of footsteps approached from around the corner. The gentle squeak of a mop bucket, the swish of a warm broom on the tile. Amara didn't look up until a soft voice spoke, steady as an old song. "Baby girl, are you all right?" She blinked and turned. There stood Miss Claudine, the school's janitor. Gray hair tucked beneath a floral scarf, deep brown skin etched with the fine lines of time, and eyes like polished mahogany, gentle but knowing. Miss Claudine didn't move closer at first. She just stood there, leaning slightly on her broom, watching Amara with the quiet kind of patience the world so rarely had. Amara tried to wipe her face quickly and force a smile. "I'm fine, just tired." Claudine nodded slowly. Tired's heavy when it's the kind of tired you feel in your bones." Amara looked away. Her fingers curled tightly around the folder in her lap. Claudine set the broom aside and lowered herself slowly onto the floor beside her, her knees cracking in protest. She didn't ask questions, just sat beside her like they were sharing a long pause in a song. After a while, Claudine spoke again. "Was it the teacher?" Amara hesitated and gave a small nod. Claudine didn't press. "I see." Her voice was low, like something pulled from the back of a gospel choir, soft but full of power. "I wrote something," Amara whispered after a moment. "Something that meant a lot, but he didn't even read it." She held up the folder slightly, then looked down at it, ashamed. "He gave me a C+. Said it was too emotional." Claudine reached out gently. "May I?" Amara paused, unsure. No one ever asked to read her writing except for grades, red pens, and corrections. But something in Miss Claudine's voice, her presence, felt safe. She nodded and handed over the young folder. Claudine opened it slowly. The title caught her eye. Her lips parted slightly as she read the first few lines. She leaned in, squinting slightly, her fingers grazing the words like braille. Silence settled again, but this time it was electric-charged. Her hands began to tremble. By the time she reached the second page, her jaw had tightened. Her breath caught. Tears didn't fall, but her eyes shone in the flickering hallway light. When she finally looked up, her voice cracked ever so slightly. "Amara, where did you learn to write like this?" Amara shrugged. "I don't know. I just wrote the truth." Claudine placed the folder on her lap, her fingers still touching its edge, as if afraid it might vanish. "Baby, this ain't just an essay. This is a voice people need to hear." Amara looked down. "It doesn't matter." He didn't believe it was good enough. Claudine's expression turned from gentle to fierce in the space of a heartbeat. "He's not the only reader in this world. Never forget that." Amara looked up, startled. Claudine gave her a small smile. "Can I tell you something? Long before I was pushing mops and picking up after these kids, I was an editor." Amara blinked. "An editor?" Claudine nodded. "Yes, ma'am. 30 years at a regional black newspaper down in Georgia. Published stories that made politicians squirm. We used our words to fight back when we couldn't use anything else." Amara stared at her, stunned. She had never heard Miss Claudine talk like this. No one had. "I retired early when they shut the paper down," Claudine continued, her voice quieter now. "Came up here to be near my sister. Took the janitor job because they needed help, and I figured why not still serve a school. But I never stopped reading, never stopped believing in words." She tapped the folder gently. "And this right here? This deserves to be read by someone who sees it for what it really is." Amara felt something stir inside her chest. Something fragile and flickering, like hope daring to breathe. Claudine stood up slowly, brushing off her skirt. "I have a friend," she said casually, as if it wasn't the beginning of something extraordinary. "Used to be one of my interns. Now she's an editor for a paper in Chicago. Young, smart, hungry for stories with a spine." She looked at Amara with kind eyes. "Would you mind if I shared this with her? Just to see what she thinks?" Amara hesitated. Her instinct was to say no, to pull back, to protect the story like something too precious to be exposed again. but something about Claudine's gaze made her nod. Okay, Claudine smiled, wide and proud. I'll handle it with care. As she walked away, folder clutched in her hands, Amara remained seated on the floor, dazed. She hadn't expected kindness in that hallway. Hadn't expected belief from someone the world overlooked. But sometimes, the people who clean up the messes are the same ones who carry the truth. The days that followed blurred into routine. School, part-time shifts at the diner on 9th Street, homework squeezed between bus rides, and nights spent helping Malik with his science projects. The essay, the one Amara had bled herself into, became just another file tucked into a drawer. Like so many of her dreams, it was folded away neatly, silently, respectfully forgotten. She hadn't asked Miss Claudine about it again. Not out of distrust, but because she didn't want to hope. Hope, she had learned, could be dangerous when you lived in a world that never expected you to win. So she let go. She focused on the small things. Keeping Malik fed, keeping her grades steady, saving tips in a jar under her bed, watching the world turn without making too much noise. The weeks passed. Then one Thursday evening, just as the sky was beginning to darken into that rich, indigo hush before night, everything changed. Amara was in the kitchen rinsing dishes, Malik humming. Cartoon theme behind her as he colored at the table. The television was on low, tuned to the evening news, half listened to at best. Her mother was still at work. The apartment, though modest, felt warm, safe, normal. Then came the call. Her phone buzzed once, then rang an unfamiliar number. Out of state. She hesitated, wiping her hands on a towel, glancing at the screen with a frown. Chicago. She answered it cautiously. Hello? A pause. Then a voice, crisp and formal, yet somehow gentle. Hello, is this Miss Amara James? She froze. Yes. Who's this? This is Lorraine Chun. I'm calling on behalf of the Pulitzer Prize Board. The words hung in the air like shattered glass sparkling. Impossible. I'm sorry? She whispered, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Lorraine continued, her tone softening slightly, as if sensing the girl on the other end was now holding her breath. We received an anonymous submission to our editorial category about 2 weeks ago, an essay titled, What Freedom Means to Me. It was forwarded through a trusted media contact. We read it, and then read it again, and again. Silence. I didn't submit anything, Amara stammered, confused. Her heart was pounding, roaring in her ears. Yes, Lorraine replied. We traced it to a former journalist who now works in education in Georgia. She refused to take credit. Sighed, and I quote, the voice belongs to the girl who wrote it. The rest of us just needed to make sure the world heard her. Amara slowly sank into a chair. Her knees had gone. Weak. Lorraine went on. I know this is unusual. We usually only consider professional journalists or published columnists for this category. But your work was undeniable. Your story, your voice. It reached everyone in the room. No one left the table the same. Amara didn't speak. She couldn't. Lorraine exhaled softly on the other end. We're calling to formally inform you that you've been selected as a recipient of this year's Pulitzer Prize for Commentary. You're the youngest winner in the history of the award. The world still. The faucet still dripped behind her. Malik still hummed at the table. Oblivious. A plane passed overhead outside, and still nothing felt real. Amara covered her mouth with one trembling hand. I don't understand. You don't have to, Lorraine said gently. Just know that your words changed something. And they're about to change a lot more. Amara blinked back the tears, her throat too tight to speak. Her fingers clutched the phone, like it was the only thing keeping her connected to reality. We'll be flying you to New York next month for the ceremony, Lorraine added. All expenses covered. We'll coordinate everything with your family. And school. For now, just breathe. Celebrate. You've earned this. And just like that, the call ended. Amara sat in stunned silence for several long moments, the phone still pressed to her ear. Long after the line had gone dead, Malik looked up from the table. Mara, you okay? She turned to him, slowly, tears now streaming down her cheeks. I think something big just happened, she whispered. He blinked, confused but intrigued. Like, egg big? She laughed just once, breathless, and unsure, and nodded. Like, change everything kind of big. He jumped down from the chair and hugged her tight. She hugged him back, her whole body trembling. Somewhere in the drawer beside her bed, her essay still sat printed and folded, just as she had left it. But now, it wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to the world. Closing image that night. Amara stood by the window, the city lights glimmering outside. The same world that had doubted her, overlooked her, dismissed her, was now listening. Not because she shouted, not because she begged, but because she wrote the truth. And somewhere, far from where she began, that truth had started a chain reaction, one that would never be stopped. New York City hummed with spring energy taxis weaving through congested avenues, flower stalls blooming on corners, and the air tinged with both ambition and pollen. High above the streets, the grand ballroom of the Waldorf shimmered like a dream carved in marble and gold. Amara stood in front of a gilded mirror backstage, her fingers curled tightly around the edges of the podium note card she had rewritten a dozen times. Her navy dress flowed down to her ankles, soft and simple, not chosen for glamour, but for grace. Her mother stood behind her, adjusting the back of her necklace. Evelyn, James's pendant worn proudly, like a whispered prayer passed through generations. The ceremony bustled just beyond the curtains. Celebrities, journalists, and powerhouses in tailored suits mingled under crystal chandeliers. Every table had its name in gold calligraphy, and every camera was waiting for a moment. But Amara? She was still the girl who had been told to write realistically, the girl who wrote in secret while the world overlooked her. And now they wanted to listen. 5 minutes, a staff member called softly. Her mother gently squeezed her shoulders. Whatever happens out there, remember who you are. Amara nodded. Moments later, she stepped into the spotlight. The ballroom erupted in applause. News anchors scribbled quotes. Guests stood. Flashes burst like fireflies in daylight. Her name echoed across the vast room, projected on giant screens. Pulitzer. Prize for commentary. Amara James, age 16. She walked slowly to the podium. Her voice, when it came, was steady, low but certain. I never imagined this. Not because I didn't believe I could write, but because I didn't think the world would care to hear it. She paused. A sea of faces watched her, some in awe, some in disbelief. I was told to stay grounded, to stop reaching, to keep it realistic. But my reality wasn't safe or simple. It was painful, beautiful, angry, and true. Another pause. She lifted her chin. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who's been told they were too emotional, too raw, too black, too broken to be heard. The room stood again before she even finished. Hands clapping, cameras rolling, and somewhere deep within her, Amara felt something. Ancient, rising, like all the voices that had been silenced were singing through her now. Thousands of miles away, in the dim, fluorescent-lit teacher's lounge of Jefferson High, the TV mounted above the microwave played the ceremony live. The volume had been turned up just enough to pull attention. Mr. Lowell stood with a paper cup of lukewarm coffee in hand, halfway to his mouth, eyes fixed on the screen. His expression was unreadable. His jaw slackened slightly. And in a historic first, the anchor announced, 16-year-old Amara James has been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for her groundbreaking essay titled, "What Freedom Means to Me." Critics are calling it a once-in-a-generation piece. The image cut to Amara at the podium. Lowell's hand trembled. Someone from the math department leaned over. "Hey, wasn't she in your class?" Lowell didn't answer. The coffee remained untouched. The speech continued, and Amara's words filled the room, eloquent, unflinching, powerful. She wasn't performing. She was revealing, testifying, unraveling truth in front of the entire world. Then her essay appeared on screen, scrolling text. Selected passages read aloud in her own voice. Freedom is not something handed down like permission. It's something we take back one breath, one word, one protest at a time. Lowell sat slowly. The TV flickered above him as her voice filled the silence. He reached into the bottom drawer of his desk, pulled out a wrinkled folder, the original copy of the essay, red ink still bruising the corner. C+. He unfolded the pages. And for the first time he read every word. His eyes moved slowly, lips parting slightly, brows tightening with each paragraph. At first he looked for flaws, then for structure, then finally for meaning. Halfway through, his hand rose to his mouth. His eyes blurred. He reached for his glasses and pressed them against his face. But it wasn't the print. He couldn't see. It was the weight. The truth. Flashback. A barren desert. Gunfire ripping the air. Screams. Sand and blood and heat. Lowell Young, terrified, crouched behind a scorched truck. His older brother Henry had run into the open. A mission no one else dared attempt. He was hit twice. Still crawled forward, captured, beaten, humiliated. His voice, once so full of life, was never the same after. They brought Henry home broken. In body, in spirit. For months he stared at the wall, hollow-eyed. One night he finally whispered, "They didn't just hit me. They stripped me of the right to speak. Made me feel less than human." Lowell had never forgotten that. But he had buried it. Pushed it so deep, he stopped recognizing that pain in others. Until now. Until Amara's words tore through him like a memory long locked away. "Freedom is when I no longer have to explain why I deserve it." The sentence sliced clean through. Him. His coffee cup tipped over. Forgotten. He stood, slowly, and walked to the window. The hallway outside buzzed with students moving between classes. Laughter, sneakers squeaking, someone shouting. Amara used to walk that hallway, alone, head down, unseen. Now, the world saw her, and he had missed it. Closing image back in the lounge, the screen returned to Amara's speech. She was smiling now, grateful, grounded, radiant. Not triumphant, but fulfilled. Lowell stood alone, her essay still in hand, marked with the grade he could never take back. But for the first time in years, he felt something crack inside. Not guilt. Not shame. Understanding. Real, aching understanding. He sat back down, placed the essay gently on the desk, and whispered, to no one in particular, "I was wrong." The applause had quieted now, settling into a reverent stillness beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Waldorf Grand. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across the polished wood stage, and every eye in the room was fixed on the slim figure. Standing behind the podium, Amara James stood there, not as a student, not as a prodigy, not even as the youngest Pulitzer winner in history. She stood as a voice, not the one that had been ignored in the back row of a classroom, or dismissed with red ink, or pushed aside in the name of objectivity. No, this voice had grown louder, stronger, unapologetically clear. Her hands rested gently on the sides of the podium, the smooth wood grounding her in the moment. She took a breath, not rushed, not nervous, measured, whole. Behind her, A towering screen displayed her name in gold, beneath a title that once lived only in her dreams. Pulitzer Prize for Commentary. She looked out at the sea of faces, journalists, writers, educators, politicians. But her gaze didn't search for status. It searched for presence. She began softly. When I first wrote this essay, I didn't expect anyone to read it. Not because I didn't believe in the words, but because I knew what it meant to be overlooked. The room leaned in. I wrote about freedom, not the kind etched in marble or printed in textbooks, but the freedom I watched my mother work for on overnight shifts, the freedom my father lost in a system too cold to care, and the freedom my grandmother marched for with blood on her blouse. She paused, her voice steady, her heart rising with every sentence. To some, I was just another student. Too quiet, too emotional, too much. But my grandmother, Evelyn James, taught me that when your voice shakes the room, don't silence it. Strength lives in the trembling. She looked down for a moment, inhaled. To my mother, who taught me that dignity doesn't need a diploma. To Miss Claudine, who saw not just my words, but my worth. And to every janitor, every server, every girl in a back row scribbling poetry. While the world talks over her, this award belongs to you too. The audience erupted into applause again, but Amara raised one hand slightly, not to stop it, but to speak through it. There was a time I believed that if someone with power dismissed my voice, then maybe it wasn't worth hearing. But now I know better. Her eyes shone not with tears, but with clarity. When people dismiss your voice, write anyway. And when they try to ignore it, write louder. A beat of silence followed her words, and then an ovation. But Amara didn't immediately bask in the applause. She allowed herself a small smile, then stepped back, folding her hands in front of her, nodding once in quiet respect to the space she had just carved with her voice. Down below the stage, lost in the sea of tuxedos and gowns, Mr. Lowell sat with his hands clasped loosely together. His program booklet lay untouched in his lap. The sharp lines of his face were softer now. His eyes, those once so critical, so sure, were wet, rimmed with something close to regret. He clapped, but slowly, almost cautiously, not out of disbelief, but reckoning. Amara's words echoed in his head, like a drumbeat he hadn't realized he'd been marching to all along. When they dismiss your voice, write louder. He remembered the way he had flipped through her pages, the way he had handed down that C+ like a sentence instead of a grade, the way he hadn't looked beyond the margin of his own bias. And now, the world looked at her and saw greatness, not because of a recommendation, not because of a title, but because she had written anyway. His hands finally met in rhythm with the applause. Slower than most, firmer than before. His face was pale, not from shame, but from realization. A girl he thought he'd taught had just taught him that as the ceremony wound down. Amara stepped away from the stage into the arms of her mother, who held her like she had when she was a little girl with nightmares and notebooks. "You did it, baby," she whispered into her ear. "No," Amara said softly. "We did?" Beside them, Miss Claudine stood with tears in her eyes, holding a tissue in one hand and her phone in the other, live streaming everything for the girls back at Jefferson High. "You always had it in you," she said. Amara turned to her. "Thank you for sending it, for believing." Claudine smiled. "My job's just to open the door. You kicked it down." Amara laughed, a full, unburdened sound one that echoed into the vaulted ceilings like freedom itself. Outside, the city glittered. Beneath the night sky, car lights blurred into stars across the pavement. A new voice, strong, fearless, undeniable, had joined the constellation of history. Back inside, Mr. Lowell remained seated long after the ceremony ended, still clapping. Still listening. Because sometimes redemption doesn't arrive in a grand apology. Sometimes it comes in the quiet recognition that you were wrong and that the student you dismissed has just become the teacher. Years passed, though Amara never measured them in calendars. She measured them in letters from young girls who had read her essay and said they felt seen for the first time. In college lectures where her name came up beside Baldwin and Morrison. In quiet visits home where Ms. Claudine always had sweet tea ready and a folded newspaper tucked under her arm with Amara's name in print. The world didn't change overnight. It never does. But her words planted in the cracks kept growing, kept reaching, kept softening something in the bones of those who once looked away. She no longer needed awards to validate her voice. She had lived through the silence. She had survived the dismissal. She had written anyway, and now she taught others to do the same. It was late afternoon. The sun cast long golden rays across the old wooden desks in room 204 of Thayer Hall, a small liberal arts college tucked into the hills of North Carolina. Dust motes floated in the warm air like tiny spirits, dancing to the hush of a settling classroom. Professor Amara James stood at the front of the room, a stack of papers in her hands and a subtle, knowing smile on her face. Her curls were pulled back now in a soft twist, and she wore a pair of thin-rimmed glasses she often forgot were on her face. Her voice had deepened over the years, not louder, but more rooted. When she spoke, people listened, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. Call on respect. She glanced around the room at 20 or so faces, diverse, uncertain, eager in that way only first-year students could be. Some leaned forward with pens poised. Others slouched, hiding nerves behind blank expressions. She remembered those faces, because she had been one of them. She set the stack of handouts down on her desk, took a breath, and began to walk between the rows, placing one sheet in front of each student. The assignment was simple. Write me a truth. It said at the top, not what you think I want to hear, not what sounds good. Just the truth. Write about freedom, about fear, about what you've never said out loud. I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking for honesty. As she returned to the front of the room, she watched them reading it. Some blinked slowly. One girl bit her lip. A boy in the corner scratched his head. They were already thinking, already feeling, and that was the point. Amara leaned against the edge of the desk and folded her arms gently, her smile still quiet, still patient. I'm not here to grade your grammar, she said, her voice even and warm. I'm here to see you. The room was silent, but alive. Then she added so softly, you might have missed it if you weren't listening. I believe in what you have to say, even if no one else ever has. It was a simple thing, but the power of being believed truly. Believed had once changed her life, and now it was her turn. Outside, the leaves swirled in slow spirals across the courtyard. The seasons were changing again. She watched them for a moment through the tall windows as students began writing, their pens gliding tentatively, then faster, more certain. She caught a glimpse of a girl in the third row, head bowed, dreadlocks tucked under a beanie, hand moving quickly across the page. Her name was Layla. She'd stayed after class the week before, asking in a whisper if she could write about something that wasn't school appropriate. Amara had smiled and said, write it anyway. That was what Miss Claudine had once said to her. Some legacies don't wear crowns. Some wear chalk dust and ink-stained sleeves. As the students bent over their desks, Amara turned toward the blackboard, erasing the remnants of last week's lecture. Her fingers smudged the chalk. Her reflection caught faintly in the glass pane of the door, and in that moment, she remembered the sound of a red pen scratching across her paper, the humiliation of a see that had nothing to do with content. The weight of her essay in Miss Claudine's hands, The stage in New York. Her mother's arms. The silence of a man who had once dismissed her voice, now filled with the sound in it. She didn't need revenge. She had purpose. It wasn't just a story. It was a mirror. And the world finally paused long enough to look in. Back in room 204, the students kept writing, pens scratching, thoughts pouring, walls falling. Amara walked slowly between the desks, pausing here and there, glancing at opening lines. When I was 5, I watched my brother. No one knows this, but I've never said this out loud. She smiled, not the smile of someone who is proud of herself, but of someone who had become what she once needed most. A girl once silenced, now helped others find their voice. And in that soft, sunlit classroom, the revolution continued. One essay at a time.